Hello everyone, welcome back and welcome to the video for Module 6 of the Disarmament Orientation course. This is the final video, so if you've made it this far, congratulations, you're almost through. Today we're going to be talking about the cross-cutting issues, these are issues which affect the full spectrum of the different disarmament topics that we've been covering throughout this course. And in particular, today we're going to be talking about gender and disarmament with Renata Dalaqua from UNIDIR. We're going to be talking about international humanitarian law with Kathleen Lawand from the Arms Unit of the International Committee of the Red Cross. And I'm afraid you're going to have to listen to me talk to you about the role of civil society in disarmament. So let's get started. We're going to talk about gender, and I'm sitting here with Renata Dalaqua. Renata works at UNIDIR on gender issues, but tell us a little bit about your title and what you do, Renata.
Hi, I'm Renata Dalaqua, and I lead UNIDIR's Gender and Disarmament program. We work to support diplomats in bridging arms control and gender frameworks.
Well, I'm going to start by asking the question which I think a lot of people want to ask but maybe don't dare. And that is, what does it mean exactly when we say gender, and when we talk about gender in disarmament diplomacy? What does that mean? What is gender?
So I think this is a really important question, Richard. The first thing I would like to say is that gender does not equal woman. So women and gender are not synonyms. When we talk about gender, we're actually talking about roles, responsibilities, behaviors, attributes associated with being a man or a woman, a girl or a boy or a non-binary person at a given time in a given context. So these are socially constructed characteristics that a society considers appropriate for a man or a woman. In this sense, they are not the same as biological sex. And they can be changed and they can evolve and throughout time and in different contexts. So in most societies, gender norms have resulted in differences and inequalities, and that's why we need to talk about gender equality. And that is why we talk about women's rights and roles, but the gender conversation should not only be about women alone.
Well, if that's gender in general, let's talk now a little bit what it means for disarmament and arms control and international security.
So far there have been two main ways of bringing gender into arms control and disarmament. The first one is the most common one, is to look at who's sitting at the table, and you will notice that they are mostly men. So diplomats negotiating arms control and disarmament have throughout time been mostly men. Women are underrepresented in this field of diplomacy much more than in other fields, let's say human rights, social, cultural affairs. And we know that because we at UNIDIR, we have looked at the lists of participants of more than 80 multilateral meetings on arms control and disarmament, and we compiled the information about gender balance across different forums on arms control and disarmament, and it can be found in this publication. It's also on our website. What we learned is that women represent on average 30% of the diplomats negotiating arms control and disarmament, and that goes from conventional weapons to weapons of mass destruction to security technology, let's say cybersecurity discussions. So that's across the board. The other thing we learned is that in smaller groups, let's say working groups or technical committees, the number of women is even less. It's even smaller, so women tend to comprise 20% of, when the delegations are smaller, when the country can only send one representative for an arms control negotiation, they most likely send a man. So in smaller settings, women are usually 20% of the diplomats, and that tells us something else. It tells us about the role women are occupying. They are not, the challenge is even bigger at leadership positions. So again, women as heads of delegations to arms control and disarmament negotiations, it's on average 20%. This means there's a lot that should be done and can be done in terms of bringing gender equality into arms control and disarmament. If we don't do anything at the rate of the current pace, it will take 2 decades to reach gender parity at the working level, and only in 2065 we calculated that's when we would have gender balance among heads of delegations. So this means taking targeted action to give women more speaking roles, making sure women get a chance to participate and shape the outcomes of the conversations and deliberations. So this is, like we say, track one of bringing gender into arms control. It's to look at representation, participation, and meaningful participation. The second way of bringing gender into arms control and disarmament is actually what we call applying a gender lens to the substance of the discussion. So is to look at how gender roles, gender norms, attributes can impact women and men in a certain context, in the context of armed violence and conflict. For instance, if gender identity leads you to, puts you at more risk, or influence how you're gonna access medical help, medical care, or it changes the way you'll be targeted by a certain weapon system or not. So this is what UNIDIR does. We do research to understand gender dynamics and in context of armed violence and conflict, and how that can be translated into arms control measures. And this may seem kind of a novel approach, but actually it has been done for some time already. A good example of bringing gender into arms control is the ATT, the Arms Trade Treaty. So based on the knowledge that we have, that actually men are the largest proportion of direct casualty of small arms, but actually women are impacted by gender-based violence facilitated by such arms. So based on this knowledge, negotiators included a clause in the ATT mandating that states parties assess the risk that exported material will be used to facilitate gender-based violence. And this is one example, but if you look also at the action plans of the Mine Ban Treaty, the Cluster Munition Convention, the Treaty on the Nuclear Weapons Prohibition, they all have clauses mandating gender-sensitive assistance. And if you look also at the first committee resolutions, we have seen an increasing number of resolutions, including gender language. Last year, we estimate that a third of the resolutions adopted contained gender-relevant language.
How does gender relate to arms control and disarmament? Gender refers to the attributes that a society considers the norm for women and men, girls and boys, as well as non-binary or gender-fluid persons. In most societies, gender norms have resulted in differences, and thus inequalities. When it comes to international forums concerned with peace and security, women are frequently underrepresented. In 2000, the United Nations Security Council approved a resolution that called for increased participation of women in peace and security decision-making. Nearly 20 years later, women make up only a third of the diplomats in arms control and disarmament forums. Still, there is hope. In 2018, the United Nations Secretary-General's Agenda for Disarmament called for the equal participation of women and men in all decision-making processes related to disarmament and international security. Women as well as men have the right to shape the outcomes of decisions that will affect their lives. But we must go beyond representation alone and ensure women can meaningfully influence decision-making. The truth is, gender norms shape how weapons are seen and used in society, as well as the impacts of weapons and violence. By applying a gender lens, we can begin to see how arms control and disarmament affect all segments of the population differently. Gender analysis is growing in recognition and has already inspired multilateral actions through a number of treaties and resolutions. UNIDIR is committed to gender equality as a key instrument of peace and security. Help us effectively integrate gender perspectives in disarmament discussions so we can ensure that everyone's security needs are properly addressed and make gender equality a reality for all.
Some very interesting ideas in there. I guess one question some people may have is, why does it matter? And coming back to track one, and you say the name of the report is still behind the curve, that the rate of participation of women in disarmament diplomacy is much lower than perhaps other areas of multilateral diplomacy. Why does that matter, and why is it important for us as diplomats?
So I'll give you three main reasons. The first one is connected to what I was saying before, is that knowledge of gender dynamics and gender disaggregated data can actually be translated into practical arms control measures and can make arms control more effective and help arms control and disarmament redress gender inequalities in the context of armed violence and conflict. The second question, it's because it's a matter of equality. It's a recognition that women and men have the same right to participate and shape the outcomes of decisions in any given area of policy or diplomacy, and arms control and disarmament is one of that area. And the third point is that that gender issues have been quite high on the public agenda in the media and have, featured in many mobilizations we've seen recently, the Me Too movement and more action towards gender equality. So I think also bringing gender into arms control and disarmament has the potential to engage more the general public. We often hear, people are not interested in arms control and disarmament, what should we do? And I think that actually can serve as a hook to bring more people on board, get the general public interested and engaged in arms control matters.
Well, looking across the whole range of disarmament work that we do here in Geneva, obviously it's a big area, and as you've explained, gender comes into it in all kinds of different ways. So what areas is UNIDIR and the gender program going to focus on over the next year?
So yes, we try to assist member states at all arms control forums, so we cover the whole spectrum of arms control and disarmament discussions. When we have to prioritize, this year we have two processes underway on cybersecurity. You have an open-ended working group and a GGE. So UNIDIR is actually conducting research to inform gender approaches to cybersecurity, trying to identify specific issues of the cyber domain that could benefit from a gender analysis. For instance, online harassment, access to technology, or gender-sensitive capacity building in the cyber realm. So this is one big part of our current program. The other thing is that in 2020, the Women, Peace and Security Agenda is celebrating 20 years. October will mark 20th anniversary of Resolution 1325. So UNIDIR is actually conducting research to identify concrete examples of where arms control and the Women, Peace and Security Agenda intersect, how arms control measures can advance not only women's participation, but also prevention and protection of sexual and gender-based violence, and relief and recovery in the aftermath of conflict. So this is something that you should expect will come out October this year. In addition to that, we are always conducting gender briefings related to discussions that are happening in Geneva, but also in New York, Vienna, and in The Hague. We published research in addition to Still Behind the Curve. We have research on specific examples of how gender dynamics interfere with weapons. So I have here this one, it's called Missing Links, and it's about gender impacts of chemical and biological weapons, for instance. And all of our work and our publications can be found at the UNIDIR Gender and Disarmament Hub. It's a dedicated corner of our website which has publications, information, and also ideas for action to bring gender into arms control and disarmament.
So lots going on. This course is for diplomats, especially for new diplomats in Geneva who are going to be working on disarmament. What can they do? I mean, if I'm a diplomat, I'm starting work on disarmament in Geneva, what can I do on gender?
So I can tell you what we've heard from diplomats themselves telling us how they bring gender into their everyday work. So some of them told us they pay attention to the composition of panels, of committees. When they report back to Capital, they include information about men and women participation, who got to speak, track this type of thing. They actually praise gender-balanced panels when reporting back to Capital. They adopt a policy of declining invitations to single-sex panels. So just this awareness of gender equality, translated into everyday action. This is one thing that diplomats can do. The other is to engage with gender analysis, to learn, develop gender expertise, which will be relevant to your posting here on arms control and disarmament, but will also be relevant to other posts you might take further in your career. So we actually encourage diplomats to engage with gender analysis and build gender expertise. A third thing that diplomats can do is to engage with the Disarmament Impact Group. It's a group that UNIDIR is one of the co-chairs, so we are always available to provide briefings and support member states in bringing gender into the agenda of the discussion, actually. So this is something else that diplomats can do. They can request a briefing, put gender in the agenda, or participate in a side event, organize a side event on gender and the topic being discussed. Yes, and UNIDIR is here to support. If you're a diplomat interested in bringing gender into arms control, please do reach out.
So if diplomats interested in learning more about what they could do or how they could work with UNIDIR and with the Disarmament Impact Group, they can come and see you here at UNIDIR.
Definitely.
All right, so everyone, thank you, Renata. I'm sure people will be coming to see you, but thank you very much for sharing this information with us today. I'm at the International Committee of the Red Cross, and I'm speaking to Kathleen Lawand, who's head of the Arms Unit here. Kathleen, thanks very much for joining us to contribute to the course. Perhaps we could start if you just tell us, what is the ICRC?
Well, that's a very good question. The ICRC has been around for a very long time, 157 years. We're a neutral, impartial, and independent humanitarian organization. We're mandated, notably under the Geneva Conventions, to protect and assist the victims of armed conflict. That is, persons who are made vulnerable and affected by armed conflict. So we think principally of civilians, but it also involves wounded soldiers, captured soldiers, prisoners of war, and other persons who are protected basically by international humanitarian law. That is the law of armed conflict or the laws and customs of war. So the ICRC is often referred to as the guardian of international humanitarian law due to our special role under the Geneva Conventions to protect and assist the victims of armed conflict. And most of our work is done in the field, so we are present in over 90 countries worldwide. Many of these countries are suffering from armed conflict, warfare, or other situations of violence. And the ICRC is present with its delegates in the field to indeed try to alleviate the suffering of the victims of armed conflict there. And this involves also a dialogue with all of the parties to the armed conflict, that is, those that are fighting these wars. It could be government armed forces, it could be non-state armed groups. We don't distinguish, we speak to all sides of an armed conflict in accordance with our neutrality and impartiality. And one of the things we're saying to these conflict parties is that they should be respecting the laws of armed conflict, international humanitarian law. So we remind them of their obligations to respect and ensure respect by their forces, the laws of armed conflict. We also endeavor to prevent suffering by engaging in a dialogue, and this is the work that we do here in Geneva, engaging in a dialogue with states and other stakeholders to promote the strengthening or clarification or even development of new rules of international humanitarian law. And this could be in instances where we see that there are gaps in protection in the field, so that the law perhaps is not clear, perhaps there are new issues arising, new forms of armed conflict arising. For example, warfare today is moving more and more into populated areas, so this is raising questions about how conflict parties are interpreting and applying the rules of international humanitarian law when they're conducting warfare in densely populated areas, concentrations of civilians, etc. So this is raising questions about how these rules, the prohibition of indiscriminate attacks, proportionality in attack, how is all of that being interpreted and faithfully implemented in urban warfare? So the new types of warfare that are raising questions about how these rules should be complied with. So we have, new types of conflict that arise and raise questions about the interpretation and faithful implementation of IHL. But then there's also the question that arises when new weapons are being developed, new technologies of warfare. And these new technologies may raise significant questions about how existing rules of IHL apply to these new technologies. So there could be major challenges applicable there. We're looking at that in particular in relation to autonomous weapon systems. What happens when a human is no longer involved in the selection and attack of targets? This raises unique questions and challenges under existing international humanitarian law. So it begs the question, well, is there a need to clarify existing law or develop new rules to address these challenges? And this is how the ICRC has been working for the last, basically since it was founded 157 years ago, and where we work both in the field and alleviating suffering, bringing protection and assistance to victims of armed conflict in the field, but also based on what we witness in the field. So the evidence of the effects of armed conflict, we bring this evidence to states to say, hey, there may be a need here to clarify or strengthen existing rules of IHL.
You've explained how ICRC is seen as the guardian of international humanitarian law and how the work it does in support of IHL and creating new IHL. But what exactly is international humanitarian law? Can you tell us what it is, what it consists of, where it comes from, and how it's developed?
Well, international humanitarian law is the body of international law that seeks to alleviate human suffering in armed conflict. So it applies in an armed conflict, be it an international, that is interstate conflict, or a non-international armed conflict. So a conflict that opposes a state against non-state armed groups or non-state armed groups between themselves. So in all of these situations, the law of armed conflict, that is international humanitarian law, basically seeks to protect persons who do not or no longer participate in the hostilities. So this is principally civilians, but it could also be soldiers that are out of combat because they are wounded, or soldiers that are captured, etc. So persons who are not or no longer participating in the hostilities are protected by IHL. In addition to that, IHL contains a series of rules that aim to limit the effects of hostilities, of the conduct of hostilities. So basically, these rules constrain the choice and use of means and methods of warfare, and this includes weapons, of course. And this is where there is an intersection with arms control and disarmament, of course, because IHL seeks for humanitarian reasons to limit the use of certain weapons. It even goes a step further and even prohibits the use of certain weapons when their effects are unacceptable from a humanitarian point of view. So this includes, for example, and now I'm referring to key rules of IHL in the conduct of hostilities, which constrain the choice of means and methods of warfare, weapons that fall foul of the prohibition of indiscriminate attacks. So attacks that are of a nature to strike military objectives and civilian objects without distinction. So these would be, this is a key rule that constrains the use of weapons. Now, weapons that are of an indiscriminate nature could be that way either because you cannot direct the weapon at a specific military objective, or because the effects of the attack escape the control of the user. That is, they cannot be limited as required by international humanitarian law. Another key rule that constrains the use of weapons in warfare is the prohibition to use means of warfare that are of a nature to cause superfluous injury and unnecessary suffering. So this is suffering in excess of what is required to achieve lawful objectives in warfare. So in excess of what would be required to neutralize enemy soldiers. Each of these rules contain a careful balance and a very pragmatic balance between the principles of humanity and humanitarian aims and military necessity. So IHL is a very pragmatic body of law that takes into account military needs as well. And then finally, there's another group of rules that aim to protect the environment, notably the rule that prohibits means of warfare that are of a nature to cause widespread, long-term, and severe damage to the natural environment. And all of these rules put together create a framework of IHL. These are the general rules of IHL that constrain the use of weapons in warfare. Now, these rules are found mainly in the additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions that were adopted in 1977, but they are also codified and consecrated in customary international law. What's important to note is that international humanitarian law tells us that there are limits to warfare. There's no such thing as wars without limits. There are limits that exist through these general rules, and then states over the years have actually provided specific prohibitions and limitations to certain weapons through treaties that they have adopted. So, for example, the use of chemical and biological weapons was prohibited already in the late 19th century through certain treaties, and then comprehensively prohibited in 1972 with the Biological Weapons Convention, and then in 1993 with the Chemical Weapons Convention. Anti-personnel mines were prohibited in 1997. One of the things that is important to note as well is that these general rules of IHL that I've just mentioned, any weapon, the lawfulness of any weapon can be judged against these rules. In other words, you don't need a specific treaty to prohibit or eliminate specific weapons.
So if I've understood what you're saying, Kathleen, you have these kind of three areas of IHL, but it all revolves around kind of controlling the way that the war is conducted. And you've explained that the value of IHL is that it has this very important and pragmatic balance between the sort of military objectives and utility and then the humanitarian concerns. How does this then relate to what we're doing in disarmament, where we do have treaties on specific weapons? We do see, the participants in this course who are diplomats here in Geneva will see the ICRC delegation at the meetings and conferences that they go to. What is then the connection? What is ICRC doing in disarmament, and how is it linking these two areas together?
Well, the ICRC's work traditionally in disarmament has been very much based on what it has seen in the field in armed conflicts in terms of the actual effects of weapons in the field. So we've taken traditionally an effects-based or evidence-based approach to weapons. How are they actually affecting civilians, combatants in the field? What are their impacts, their humanitarian impacts when used in armed conflict? And it's what we've witnessed in armed conflicts, when we've witnessed patterns of harm to civilians or the effects on human health in terms of their impacts on combatants or their effects on the environment. And when we've seen that these effects have been really unacceptable, this is when we have brought this to the attention of states and asked them to take measures to limit or even prohibit the use of certain weapons.
So this is what's motivating, for example, the ICRC's contribution to getting the CCW
Absolutely.
Established and
Exactly.
then expanded, and the Anti-Personnel Mineman Convention and
Absolutely.
Cluster Conventions. And most recently, I guess, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. You've also been
That's
contributing
right.
Information and studies on the effects of these weapons.
Absolutely. So, for example, we were in Hiroshima in 1945. We just commemorated the 75th anniversary of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Well, the ICRC was the first international humanitarian organization to arrive at Hiroshima. This was 2-3 weeks after the atomic bomb, and we witnessed a scene beyond imagination. And there were still tens of thousands of wounded people. Over 100,000 people had been killed in the atomic bombing. And what we witnessed as well is that humanitarian organizations just could not provide adequate humanitarian assistance. This was completely beyond our capabilities, given the colossal scale of the needs created by the nuclear detonation. And the long-term impacts of radiation exposure, with people falling ill and dying months and years after the atomic bombing. And this is what drove us to call for a ban on nuclear weapons. We called for nuclear weapons to be outlawed already in September 1945. And since then, we've been regularly calling for the ban on these weapons. I could also mention, as yet another example, is our work on anti-personnel mines. So in the late 1980s and early 1990s, ICRC doctors were documenting what they called, in clinical terms, an epidemic of death and injury of civilians from the use of anti-personnel mines in conflicts around the world. In virtually all the conflicts where anti-personnel mines were used, this led to massive civilian death and injury. These weapons blindly struck whoever may step on them, be it a soldier or civilian. And having documented the devastating effects on civilians over decades, in the mid-1990s, the ICRC called for a ban on anti-personnel mines, because these weapons were clearly unacceptable. Our call for a ban on these weapons was very much based on, indeed, the evidence of what we saw in the field. So it's this effects-based approach that I described and that we take.
So we could say then that what the ICRC brings to the arms control and disarmament sphere, if you like, is two things. First, its role as custodian of international humanitarian law, so you can provide the analysis and the assessment of what a new weapon or what a new situation might mean in terms of existing IHL. And also you bring this very thorough amount of effects-based evidence, what is happening with these weapons in the field in reality, what effects are they causing.
Right.
So I mean, is this what I guess our colleagues could expect from the ICRC delegation at any particular negotiation or conference, that these are the perspectives you'll be bringing?
Absolutely. We will bring, again, as I said, we will bring an evidence-based or effects-based approach. So what are the foreseeable impacts that this weapon will have when they're used in armed conflict? And this will be based on what we see ourselves in theaters of armed conflict where we are present. Well, what we've seen in the last decades, especially the last 30 years, I would say, is really an exponential development of treaties that prohibit or limit the use of certain weapons, but based on humanitarian considerations. It's what some stakeholders call humanitarian disarmament. And this is where there is an important intersection between traditional disarmament and arms control approaches, that is, that aim to not just ban weapons, but include requirements to disarm the weapons, so destroy stockpiles of weapons and so on, and combining that with humanitarian action, as it were, to protect civilians from the effects of these weapons. So mine clearance, bans on use of the weapons because the use of the weapon would fall foul of general rules of international humanitarian law, in particular weapons that may have indiscriminate effects and so on. So this is a trend that we've seen, I would say, over the last 2-3 decades, and that has been combined, for example, in the prohibition on anti-personnel mines and the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention, the Convention on Cluster Munitions. So these treaties, which didn't just ban the weapon because of their humanitarian impacts, these treaties included disarmament requirements, so requirements to actually eliminate completely the weapon. And that has been a very, I would say, positive development which has affected a convergence, in a sense, between IHL, International Humanitarian Law, and disarmament law. Now, interestingly, these treaties have been, be it the ban on, as I said, anti-personnel mines, cluster munitions, the ban, for example, on blinding laser weapons, also in the mid-1990s. So these were weapons that were designed to deliberately blind enemy combatants. These weapons were banned because they were deemed cruel weapons and unacceptable. So all of these prohibitions and limitations, for example, on incendiary weapons in Protocol 3 of the CCW, which prohibits the use of air-launched incendiary weapons against military objectives located in populated areas. So these prohibitions and limitations are based either on the IHL prohibition of indiscriminate attacks, so to do away with indiscriminate weapons that are of a nature to strike military targets and civilian objects without distinction, or banning the weapon because it is cruel, it causes excessive suffering, so the example of blinding laser weapons. So these two fundamental rules of IHL have grounded these treaties prohibiting or limiting certain weapons. But beyond that, we also have an important treaty that has an important humanitarian driver, and that's the Arms Trade Treaty. So the Arms Trade Treaty, which aims to impose certain limits on the arms trade, prohibits arms transfers where there would be a certain level of risk that violations of IHL will occur. So the Arms Trade Treaty aims to prohibit arms transfers where there is an overriding risk of serious violations of international humanitarian law, or for that matter of human rights, occurring.
So in a way the ATT is kind of preemptively reinforcing IHL.
Well, exactly. I mean, that's the idea there is to prevent arms falling into the hands of those who would use them to commit serious violations of IHL or of human rights.
As you've mentioned, there's a formidable amount of expertise in the ICRC on IHL and related matters. I guess you and your colleagues are available to help
Absolutely.
course participants. What can you offer?
So if there are any questions about IHL and how it applies to weapons, participants could refer to the arms unit in the ICRC. We have also developed some tools to help people who want to learn more about IHL. We've developed an app, the ICRC has developed an app on IHL treaties that I would encourage participants to download and use. And it contains all of the treaties, the IHL treaties that apply to weapons, that limit or prohibit the use of certain weapons. We've also developed an online course on IHL, which also could be extremely useful and helpful for the course participants.
I'm going to be talking to you about the role of civil society in disarmament. The reason we've chosen me to do this is that I've worked as a diplomat in disarmament affairs, I've worked for the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs as a UN official, and I've worked in a couple of different NGOs working on disarmament. So I've seen things from all different sides of the fence, if you like. So I want to talk to you today about what role exactly civil society plays in disarmament. It's really quite an important role, but there's a number of aspects that it's good to understand if you want to work effectively as a diplomat with members of civil society, with NGOs, with academic institutions, with think tanks, with others. So let me start by saying that there are really two major types of NGOs or civil society organizations working in the disarmament field, and I've called them advocacy organizations and information organizations. Advocacy organizations, it's kind of obvious what they do. They are the organizations that are pushing for a certain thing, advocating for progress. It may be a specific treaty or outcome, for example, the international campaign to ban landmines, or the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, the campaign to stop killer robots, we've heard from earlier in the course. All these are big international coalitions consisting of many different member organizations, but they're pushing for a particular goal. They're advocating for a particular goal. These we call the advocacy organizations. You will come across them a lot. If you're working on killer robots, for example, you'll be constantly hearing from the Stop Killer Robots campaign. If you've worked on the ATT, you will have had quite a lot to do with Control Arms, for example, that organization, which played an instrumental role in the achievement of the Arms Trade Treaty in the first place. And indeed, these campaigns have often been very successful and played a major and important role in creating treaties in the first place. The International Campaign to Ban Landmines, ICBL, was a major player in getting the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention off the ground, and for its efforts was rewarded with the Nobel Peace Prize. Similarly, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017 for its crucial role in getting the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons achieved. Clearly, these organizations are a very important part of the scene. You will be working with them, perhaps you'll be working against them. Not everybody shares their goals, of course, but that's part of the game, and as professional diplomats, I'm sure I don't need to explain that to you. The other kind of NGOs are what I call information NGOs. It's not a great name. If any of you can think of a better one, please let me know. But let's call them information NGOs. These are more the academic kind of NGOs, the academic institutions, the universities, the think tanks, those that try to contribute to disarmament process and arms control processes by providing information, data, analysis, studies. These are the kinds of contributions that those organizations make. And of course, they play a very valuable role in all our work, providing the data, the analysis and so on that we need to base our decisions on and to build international law together. There's not much overlap between these two groups of organizations. There is a little. Some of the advocacy groups do research, of course. They do research to support their advocacy, to support their positions, to persuade others. And then on the other side, some of their more academic organizations do sometimes take policy positions. They might publish recommendations or ideas on what they think governments should do. So there is a bit of overlap. Some of the organizations you may be familiar with, like Reaching Critical Will of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, some of the representatives of which have been participating in the interactive sessions. Region Critical Will does do a bit of both. They have a very extensive website you may have used where they keep track of all the statements and documents and so on associated with the different treaties. This is a very important resource. I use it all the time. I really recommend you take a look at it if you haven't. But they also are quite a strong and powerful advocacy organisation trying to make progress in a number of different disarmament areas. So they're not focused on one particular treaty, but on several. So a little bit of overlap, but on the whole, you can look at, there are groups you'll be working with who are advocacy groups. They're pushing for a certain outcome. They want to persuade you. They want to work with you. They want to get to their goal. Then there are the others who are providing you with research, with data, with background, with information, with analysis, and that's a very important contribution as well. So what do NGOs want? How do they work? How do they try to achieve their goals? What are they concerned about? I've made this little list of things that NGOs worry about. The first thing really that comes up all the time is access, and you will have heard this. How can NGOs, how can civil society get sufficient access to the disarmament processes which they want to contribute to? And there's a wide range of practices out there. If you've participated at all in different disarmament meetings, such as the Conference on Disarmament, the Biological Weapons Convention meetings, or the various meetings of the conventional arms treaties, you'll see there's quite a range of practice and procedure in terms of how civil society organisations are allowed to access the proceedings. And this is, of course, you can imagine this is great concern for NGOs themselves. It's very important for them to be able to get to the meetings, to be able to talk to delegates, to be able to make their written information available, to speak at meetings and try to persuade you, to bring information to your attention. So obviously being allowed into the meeting in the first place is very important. And then once you're in a meeting, there are different degrees of access. Are you playing on a more or less equal footing with governments in terms of being able to take part in the meeting and the discussions? Generally, in fact, always, NGOs won't be taking part in making decisions. But in some treaties, such as the Anti-Personal Mine Ban Treaty, for example, we might say NGOs are almost first-class citizens in terms of how they're allowed to participate in the conference, and they take part in the debates on pretty much an equal footing with the government delegations, and they're seen as very much an integral part of the community that's implementing that treaty. On the other end of the spectrum, you have the Conference on Disarmament, which was really stuck in the last century in terms of NGO access. There's almost no access at all. It's very formalistic and structured. Very little opportunity at all for civil society to participate in the work of the CD. Then there are ones in between, the Biological Weapons Convention, for example, where NGOs are allowed to come to the meetings, but they are somewhat constrained in terms of how much they can participate in the formal sessions of the meeting. Usually there's an informal session set aside for NGOs to make statements to the meeting, and they can distribute their documents in their room, for example. So there is this range of practice. Debates come up from time to time about should NGOs be given greater access. Many governments are open to this in principle, but like so many things in disarmament, the devil is in the detail. So when you get down to trying to decide, well, if we give NGOs more access, under what conditions? Should it be just any NGO? You get into some quite difficult questions, like what is an NGO? How do we decide as governments which organisations are relevant to our work? Do we just let anybody come in? Are we going to limit it to a particular number or type of NGOs? Do the NGOs have to sort of prove themselves somehow? Should they be approved one by one by the member states? And these are quite tricky questions. I mean, even for governments who are really open to the idea of greater civil society participation, it's not all that straightforward, because while it's obvious perhaps that, for example, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons should be participating in discussions on nuclear disarmament, there are hundreds, possibly thousands of smaller NGOs interested in nuclear disarmament. Can they all come? Should they all be allowed to speak? And who decides? Who decides which NGO takes the floor, when, and how much time can they take, and so on. And there are also very difficult questions about when governments are then sitting in judgment about which NGOs are qualified or not. And that can, of course, get very political very quickly, and you can waste a lot of time in arguing. So things tend to regress perhaps to the lowest common denominator, where we want to keep access as open as possible, and that means in many cases keeping the participation constrained. So it's pretty much open to all NGOs to attend the meeting and to register and to listen to the proceedings, but their access to actually speaking and participating in the debates is somewhat limited. And if you want to do something about that, it's quite a knotty problem. I'd be very interested to hear your ideas of how to make things better. Another big concern, perhaps the biggest concern for NGOs, is influence. This is obviously a concern for the advocacy groups. That's their key criterion for whether they're achieving their aims. Are they influencing governments? Are governments listening to them? Are governments' positions shifting? And so on. But it's also a consideration for the information groups, for the think tanks and academics and so on, because they want to know if their work is relevant, if it's helping, are governments listening to them, are they providing useful information, because they need to justify their efforts as well. So influence is a big consideration for all civil society participants. Then there's the question of tactics. NGOs, again, especially the advocacy groups, are very much always thinking about their tactics. How should they approach the issue? Who should they speak to? What aspects of an issue should they emphasize? What will be effective here? What will be effective there? Should they be confrontational? Should they be collaborative? Should they work with this government versus that government? Should they try and form a coalition with other NGOs? Should they try and form a coalition with governments? And if you look at the record in disarmament over the past few decades, you'll see that probably the most effective outcomes have been when NGOs have worked with each other in coalitions and, crucially, with governments. So the very successful treaties we've seen, such as the Anti-Personnel Mine Convention, really are based on a very solid level of cooperation and collaboration between NGOs and governments, and that drove the formation of the treaty in the first place, and now is really driving its continuing implementation. The Arms Trade Treaty also another very good example of collaboration between NGOs and governments to get a very important goal. So you'll see tactical considerations coming up all the time. One big question is sometimes how confrontational to be. We don't really see in disarmament the extremes you see in some other areas like environmental politics, where you have groups like Greenpeace, for example, who might be throwing paint or chaining themselves to gates. Perhaps it's a bit dull in disarmament. We don't have that sort of drama. On the other hand, there are questions about how confrontational an approach should be. Is it worth taking on big, powerful governments directly? Is it perhaps more effective to take a more subtle approach? These are the things that NGOs discuss within their coalitions, trying to decide, what is the most effective tactic in any given situation. Of course, another big consideration for NGOs, as it is for governments and everyone else, is funding. This, of course, money is the lifeblood of NGOs. They can't do anything if they don't have money. Participating in conferences in Geneva and New York, of course, is very expensive. If you want to have an effective presence, it's going to cost a lot of money. So NGOs are always very much looking at funding, where they can find it. They will want to talk to you about funding. They'll be talking to foundations and private funders also. It's really a key concern. If you can help as governments, please do so. I mean, we've seen that government and NGO collaboration can be very effective in terms of getting concrete outcomes in disarmament. If you have the option to fund the activities of NGOs whose interests you support, whose goals you share, please consider doing so, because it can really make a huge difference. A final thing that NGOs worry about is other NGOs. Obviously, we've talked about funding, we've talked about influence and access, and there's a degree of competition there. Of course, NGOs will say, yes, we're all working together, and to a large extent they are, but nevertheless, there is some competition. There's scarce resources that everyone's going after. There's a limited number of seats at the table at a given conference or forum. Who's going to be there? Who's going to speak? This is obviously a concern. It needs to be resolved. It can get particularly difficult when there are NGOs with quite different aims, in fact, diametrically opposed aims. And we see the most stark example of this perhaps in the Arms Trade Treaty and conventional weapons, when you have a number of really quite influential and powerful non-government organisations that are in favour of gun rights. These mainly come from the United States, but also from other countries. And they are, very interested in protecting the access of their members to firearms, and they view with great suspicion treaties like the Arms Trade Treaty or any kind of government or international restriction on access to small arms. But they're members of civil society, they are NGOs, they have a right to participate in multilateral forums along with all the other members of civil society. So balancing that when their aims are really completely opposite to the rest of the NGOs who are participating, that can be a delicate balance, and does need some real diplomacy sometimes to make sure that it's fair and that everyone has access, and no one's really being favoured, but that everyone's kept happy. So that's just to alert you to some challenges that perhaps not always so visible to government delegates, but NGOs have their own politics too, and sometimes it's good to be aware of that. I also want to say something about the practicalities as diplomats of working with NGOs and civil society in coalitions. Sometimes we hear complaints from civil society that diplomats or governments sometimes tend to take more than they give. That's putting it perhaps a bit too simply. But for an effective coalition, there really has to be a two-way exchange. It's not just NGOs feed you with information and tactical advice and you go and do your thing. I think it works better, and I'm sure my NGO colleagues would agree, it works better if the information is really flowing both ways, and it's a full collaboration. That is, you're sharing views on tactics, process, documents, procedure. You're not just keeping people shut out of your decision-making loop, but decisions are being taken collaboratively, and information is flowing freely in both directions. Because you can quite easily damage relationships with civil society if you sort of gladly take what they have to offer, and often what they have to offer is very valuable to your government. But if you're not then reciprocating and collaborating in your turn, you're not going to enjoy fruitful cooperation for very long. So I really encourage you to explore the options for working with civil society in these times where disarmament is really bogged down, and we've seen in this course of facing a number of very serious challenges. Working with partners in civil society does offer a potential way to break through some of these barriers and make some progress, perhaps in new and innovative ways. So please keep an open mind. Please be open to talking to NGOs, even those that are really working apparently quite counter to your aims and objectives. You can still learn a lot from talking with them and cooperating with them. And really the whole system will work better if we have a free flow of information between governments and civil society. That's it for this video. That's the end of the videos. You've made it through. Congratulations. Thank you for your persistence, for your attention. We really hope you found these videos interesting and informative and good preparation for the interactive sessions. Please let us know what you thought of them. We're going to be sending around a survey. We haven't done a course like this before, totally virtual. So give us your feedback as honestly and directly as you can. We really want to know what you think so that we can make improvements for next year. Thank you very much. See you in the interactive session. Well done.